There is an economic ghost haunting the capitals of the West. It wears a suit tailored in the 1980s, carries a briefcase filled with worthless real estate deeds, and whispers a warning that Washington and Frankfurt refuse to hear. That ghost is Japan. For decades, we dismissed Japan's plight as a bizarre, isolated anomaly, a strange corner case of demographic decline and cultural preference for saving. We looked at their 20 years of stagnation, their zero interest rates, and their failed quantitative easing experiments, and we assured ourselves, it can't happen here. This assurance is the ultimate deception. The truth is, the fundamental choices made by the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank over the last 15 years, the massive debt accumulation, the suppression of interest rates to zero, the unprecedented use of money printing, QE, these were not new innovative policies. They were a direct, aggressive, and inflated repeat of the very mistakes Japan made 40 years ago. The West learned nothing from the failure of the Japanese monetary experiment, and now we are all about to pay the price for that hubris. Japan was the laboratory. The world is the test subject. We are not just heading toward a recession or a soft landing. We are heading into the ghost of Tokyo, a deep, prolonged structural crisis defined by debt deflation, demographic collapse, and the complete paralysis of central banks. We are on the precipice of not just a slow period, but a systemic failure where the central bank's primary tools lose all efficacy against the compounding weight of unpayable debt. This is the story of how a nation went from global economic superpower to perpetual stagnation. And more critically, this is the story of the timeline, the precise sequence of events, from currency manipulation to asset bubbles to the tragic policy errors that guarantees Japan's lost decades are about to become the world's lost generation. We must dissect every fatal decision, every ignored signal to understand the trajectory of our own demise. The ghost is here, and the cost of ignoring its warning is all your wealth. To understand the scale of the coming collapse, you must first understand the scale of the ambition that fueled Japan's rise. By the late 1970s, Japan was a nation reborn. Following the 1979 oil crisis, the Bank of Japan, BOJ, did something Western central banks never dared. It pioneered a unique quasi-authoritarian monetary tool called window guidance. This was not simply setting an interest rate, this was strategic credit allocation. Unlike the theoretical free market approach of the West, the BOJ directly dictated credit quotas to commercial banks, instructing them precisely which sectors, steel, shipbuilding, automobiles, high-tech manufacturing, should receive capital and how much. Window guidance bypassed the slow, inefficient nature of traditional monetary policy. It funneled massive capital directly into industries prioritized by the government, turbocharging industrial growth at a phenomenal rate. Japan became the undisputed global master of manufacturing efficiency, flooding the world with high-quality, inexpensive goods. This process, however, fundamentally distorted capital markets, replacing risk-based lending with politically directed lending. This system prioritized national industrial targets over genuine market viability, meaning that inefficient capital allocation was baked into the system from the start. The seeds of the future zombie economy, dependent on state direction rather than true profits, were planted here, hidden beneath a veneer of spectacular export success. By the mid-1980s, the speed and scale of Japan's economic expansion terrified the United States. Japan's dominance was perceived not merely as healthy competition, but as an existential economic threat to American global leadership. This fear set the stage for the first massive externally imposed policy era, one orchestrated directly by the US government. The year 1985 marks the true inflection point, the moment the external world delivered the killing blow to Japan's internal stability. With the US running massive trade deficits, the Treasury Secretary James Baker convened a meeting with G5 finance ministers, US, UK, France, West Germany, Japan, at the Plaza Hotel in New York. The resulting Plaza Accords were a coordinated attempt to weaken the US dollar, USD, and critically massively appreciate the Japanese yen, JPY. The goal, sold to the public, was to make Japanese exports more expensive, thus correcting the US trade deficit. It was an explicit aggressive use of currency policy as an economic weapon designed to cripple a competitor. The unintended consequences were immediate and fatal. The JPY immediately surged, making Japanese goods 50% more expensive in global markets in just 3 years. Japan's massive export-driven companies, facing a catastrophic collapse in international sales and profit margins, demanded immediate relief and support from the BOJ. The BOJ, under immense political pressure, responded by slashing interest rates to rock-bottom levels, essentially trying to compensate exporters for the rapid currency appreciation through domestic stimulus. This attempt at damage control was the second and arguably most fatal internal policy error that directly fueled the asset bubble. The entire Japanese system was now drowning in artificially cheap credit, a credit bubble created not by organic demand or productive investment, but by a geopolitical currency weapon that forced the central bank's hand. The vast ocean of cheap money meant to support exporters instead flowed directly into speculative assets. With interest rates suppressed to counteract the yen's rise, this ocean of cheap money flooded into domestic markets. This credit did not flow back into productive manufacturing or genuine innovation. It flowed into the one place it could generate maximum leverage and minimum oversight: assets. The result was one of the most spectacular, terrifying, and delusional asset bubbles in modern history. The sheer scale of the speculation was irrational. Land values exploded. At its peak in 1989, the land beneath the Imperial Palace in central Tokyo was reportedly valued higher than all the real estate in the entire state of California combined. Banks were recklessly lending 100% and sometimes 120% of the collateral's value, convinced that land prices could never fall. The frenzy was matched in the stock market. The Nikkei 225 index reached nearly 39,000 points. The average price to earnings PE ratio soared to over 60, meaning investors were paying 60 years worth of earnings for a single dollar of profit. A valuation based entirely on the utopian yet fragile belief that the government and the BOJ would never allow prices to fall. This feverish speculative environment, funded by politically cheap credit following the Plaza Accords, was the peak illusion. Every analyst who looks at the Western world's QE and ZIRP years, the explosion in corporate debt, the staggering valuations in US real estate, and the S&P 500's record highs should feel a cold dread seeing the horrifying reflection of 1980s Japan staring back from the mirror of history. We chose to replicate the delusion, but we are about to inherit the reckoning. In late 1989, the Bank of Japan, finally succumbing to intense external pressure and internal panic over the speculative madness that threatened social stability, made its second colossal and ultimately fatal policy error. It sharply raised interest rates. This rate hike was too little, too late, and executed with shocking speed. It was the single decisive pin that burst the greatest asset bubble in history. When rates went up, the cost of servicing the mountain of bubble-era debt held by nearly every major real estate firm, corporation, and speculator, immediately skyrocketed. Asset prices, the foundation upon which this colossal debt structure was built, went into freefall. Stocks crashed violently and land prices began a multi-decade, relentless plummet. This rapid destruction of asset values created the debt-deflation spiral, the core paralyzing mechanism of Japan's tragedy. As asset prices collapsed, the nominal debt remained, meaning the real burden of the debt increased relative to the borrower's net worth. Borrowers were suddenly and technically bankrupt, forcing them into a desperate state of deleveraging. They had to slash spending, lay off workers, and sell assets at ever lower prices just to service their enormous outstanding loans. This collective forced deleveraging drastically decreased aggregate demand across the entire economy, reinforcing a vicious cycle of deflation, falling prices and wages, which in turn made the existing debt even harder to pay back in real terms. The government and the banks were utterly paralyzed, caught in a self-reinforcing terminal decline they could not stop. The banking system was the immediate epicenter of this paralysis. This policy prevented the necessary but painful cleansing of the system. It tied up massive amounts of capital, human and financial, that should have been liquidated and redirected to productive new companies. The entire financial sector was left operating with hidden systemic rot. The crisis did not stay hidden forever. In 1997, several major banks collapsed, nearly triggering a full-blown financial panic. The uniquely Japanese response involved media self-censorship. The financial press collectively agreed not to report on certain bank runs to prevent the panic from spreading. This decision, a blend of cultural conformity and state guidance, averted a sudden, quick, painful collapse, but it cemented the slow, grinding death of the financial sector's productivity. When the government finally hesitantly intervened, it injected massive public funds to stabilize the banks, but at a catastrophic cost. Private debt and private losses were transferred onto the public balance sheet. Japan's national debt, which was once manageable, began its relentless, explosive ascent, primarily due to the state absorption of bubble-era losses. The parallels to the post-2008 Western economy are horrifyingly clear and structurally identical. The US government and Fed, learning only the wrong lessons from Japan, chose to bail out insolvent banks and keep zombie sectors alive through near-zero rates, ZIRP, and quantitative easing, QE, preventing the necessary deleveraging. This action created a new structurally unstable bubble. Today, the US is facing the commercial real estate CRE Cliff, where over $1.5 trillion in debt is set to mature against rapidly falling office and retail property values. The regional banks, exactly like Japan's banks in the 1990s, are holding the bag on these loans, many of which are already NPLs in waiting. The failure to liquidate bad debt in the 1990s is the primary reason Japan experienced the debt-deflation spiral. The failure to liquidate bad debt after 2008 guarantees the West faces the same paralyzing multi-decade fate. We have merely delayed the inevitable collapse by 2 decades, leveraging up the entire system in the process. By the early 2000s, Japan was structurally trapped. Interest rates were at zero, meaning the traditional blunt tool of monetary policy, rate cuts, was useless. This is the condition known as the zero lower bound, ZLB. The central bank had lost its ability to stimulate through conventional means. In desperation, the Bank of Japan pioneered a radical, unprecedented policy, quantitative easing, QE. This was not just a minor adjustment, it was a revolution in central banking, the first time a major economy admitted the system was fundamentally broken. QE involves the central bank creating new money out of thin air and using it to purchase assets, primarily long-term government bonds, from commercial banks. The theory was simple: inject massive liquidity, raise the price of these assets, lower long-term interest rates, force banks to lend out the reserves, and break the deflationary expectations. However, the Japanese economy was so saturated with debt, so paralyzed by fear, and so structurally damaged by the zombie forbearance policy that QE failed completely. The money created by the BOJ did not flow into the real economy where it might have sparked consumption or investment. It sat inertly on the commercial banks' balance sheets as excess reserves, or it flowed into global assets, creating foreign asset bubbles which later hurt Japan. The problem wasn't a lack of money, it was a lack of demand, a paralysis of lending due to insolvency fears, and a total breakdown of the monetary transmission mechanism. The lesson, brutally ignored and violently repeated by the West post-2008, was this: you cannot print demand. When the system is structurally broken, liquidity injection only inflates the financial sector, not the real economy. The greatest challenge facing the BOJ was not the balance sheet, but the psychology. After 2 decades of falling prices, deflationary expectations became completely entrenched in the minds of the Japanese people and corporations. This psychological anchoring proved to be the central bank's unbeatable enemy. Consumers and corporations rationally chose to hoard cash. Why spend $100 today when you know the same item will cost $98 next year? This high propensity to save, combined with a lack of compelling new investment opportunities due to structural economic stagnation, made every attempt at monetary stimulus inert. Household savings remained stubbornly high, gutting consumer demand and rendering trillions in stimulus ineffective. Furthermore, companies expecting future prices to fall were hesitant to raise wages. Workers, also expecting prices to fall, were hesitant to demand higher pay. This prevented the necessary wage price spiral needed to spark sustainable organic inflation. The BOJ tried everything from targeting the money supply to massive asset purchases, but the psychological anchor of deflation proved unbreakable. The Western response post-2008, where everyone assumes the Fed will print, created the opposite psychological anchor, inflationary expectations. But the ultimate structural result, paralyzed growth due to debt saturation, remains exactly the same. Compounding the policy failures and psychological hurdles was a force no central bank can possibly control: demographics. Starting in the 2010s, Japan's population decline accelerated rapidly, hitting negative growth and featuring an unprecedented aging population. The shrinking and aging population creates 2 fundamental terminal problems for economic growth that monetary policy cannot solve: a structurally shrinking labor force, fewer producers and taxpayers, and a fundamentally shrinking consumption base, fewer young consumers and more elderly citizens who are typically net savers. This demographic reality fundamentally dampens aggregate demand, kills business confidence, and eliminates future investment opportunities. Any policy designed to boost growth or inflation faces a massive structural headwind. The customer base is literally shrinking every year. This demographic reality is now dawning on Western nations, especially Southern and Eastern Europe and increasingly the US, and will soon become a central, unavoidable feature of the global stagnation story, making recovery exponentially harder than it was in Japan as initial crisis years. In 2012, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe launched Abenomics, a radical last-ditch policy, aggressive monetary easing, QE on steroids, with an explicit 2% inflation target, flexible fiscal spending, and structural reforms. The monetary arrow was fired at an unprecedented scale. The BOJ committed to buying bonds until they owned virtually the entire market. The BOJ now owns over 70% of all outstanding Japanese government bonds, JGBs, meaning the government is literally paying interest to itself, and it became a major shareholder in the domestic stock market via ETFs. Despite this radical intervention, the most aggressive monetary policy in history, Abenomics largely failed to achieve sustained 2% inflation or robust GDP growth. The structural problems were too deep. Corporations simply hoarded profits or paid high dividends, failing to significantly raise wages. The demographic collapse was too powerful. The lesson of Abenomics is stark. When a mature economy is trapped by debt and demographics, the printing press loses its magic. The policy tools become political tools, generating massive distortion and market instability, but not real growth. The world, especially the US, with its current debt levels and political paralysis, has now stepped into the Abenomics trap, guaranteeing the hyper-stagflation outcome that is far more toxic than Japan's managed deflation. Japan's story is a profound two-sided lesson in the limits of monetary policy in mature industrialized economies. Central banks can create credit, but they cannot force lending, and they cannot force spending when the fundamental incentives are broken. However, the crucial finding is that Japan's long stagnation is not an absolute failure. It represents an economy that consciously chose stability and high employment over rapid growth and creative destruction. Its major banks did not fail en masse. They were bailed out. Unemployment never spiked to depression levels, and the quality of life remains world-class. The trade-off was stagnation, a slow, grinding economic anemia rather than a sudden, acute heart attack. Furthermore, a critical nuance often missed by Western commentators is the internal debt structure. Japan's massive government debt, over 250% of GDP, is largely owned domestically by Japanese citizens and institutions. This unique internal ownership structure means the debt burden is fundamentally less threatening than external comparison suggests, as the nation essentially owes the debt to itself. This fiscal reality allowed Japan to maintain stability despite its astronomical debt ratio. However, the fundamental difference between Japan, lost decades, and the West OS impending crisis is the starting point of the debt and the policy goal. Japan's crisis was triggered by private sector debt, real estate, that was transferred to the government, resulting in a primary policy struggle against deflation. The current Western crisis is defined by massive unchecked sovereign debt before the next great crisis even peaks. This means when the next inevitable financial crisis hits, likely triggered by the CRE Cliff or a geopolitical shock, the central banks will have virtually no room to maneuver, as their balance sheets are already bloated and their interest rates are constrained by the colossal interest payments required to service the government's own debt. The Western future is not deflation, it is hyper-stagflation. The Fed, paralyzed by the political imperative to save the existing debt structure and fund the government as endless deficits, will be forced to print money to cover fiscal shortfalls and bail out key sectors. This printing, combined with structural supply costs, deglobalization, energy transition, labor scarcity, guarantees the toxic mix: persistently rising prices, inflation, combined with permanently falling growth, stagnation. This is the hyper-stagflation trap. The Ghost of Tokyo has delivered its final comprehensive warning. Your survival and ability to create generational wealth depends on positioning your portfolio not for the comfortable binary choice of inflation or deflation, but for the guaranteed paralysis of the hyper-stagflation trap. The core principle must be, hold assets that cannot be printed and benefit from chaos. This means prioritizing Defense 1, the liquidity imperative, maximize your cash reserves, holding 18 to 24 months of expenses, and dedicate a significant portion to opportunity capital in highly liquid instruments like short-term treasuries or high-yield savings. You must be fully liquid when asset prices collapse under the pressure of stagnation and forced selling. Your cash is ammunition paid to wait for the collapse. You must also focus on Defense 2, the structural winners. Physical gold and silver are the ultimate hedge against the failure of the central bank's mandate. They cannot be printed, and they represent sound money that is immune to the currency debasement inherent in the hyper-stagflation strategy. Additionally, invest in hard assets and real resources, things the world needs and cannot easily replicate, like energy infrastructure, productive farmland, and companies that own the raw materials. These assets can raise prices alongside inflation, protecting you, but are necessary even during stagnation. Finally, prepare for the generational opportunity, the great transfer. The collapse of the traditional 60-40 portfolio and the failure of the CRE-laden regional banks will create immense distress and forced selling. This is your moment to buy the CRE, collapse, and acquire sound businesses at deeply discounted prices using your dry powder. The central bank will continue to lie. They will call it a soft landing. They will blame external forces. Your survival and success depend entirely on rejecting their lie and positioning yourself for the inevitable truth. Hyper-stagflation is the future. The system is broken, but your portfolio doesn't have to be.